Today is June 8th, 2025, and this is episode 309 of the Defensive Security Podcast. My name is Jerry Bell, and joining me today, as always, is Mr. Andrew Callett.
Good afternoon, sir. How are you?
I am awesome. How are you?
You know, it's Sunday, so trying to figure out what I didn't get done this weekend before the work week starts up again, but such is life. All good.
I hear that.
Otherwise, yeah, cruising along. Staying alive.
Awesome. Well, just a reminder before we get into our stories that the thoughts and opinions we express on the show are ours and not those of our employers. Then next, a special thank you to our Patreon sponsors. Thank you very much for your support. And also thank you to our growing list of special sponsors of the podcast that we've been playing. And I'll play the next spot right now. In today's digital world, it's not if you'll get hacked. It's when, how badly, and whether or not you'll pretend it was a sophisticated nation-state actor. That's where we come in. At Byte Safe Assurance, we specialize in covering the bare minimum after a catastrophic data breach. Our motto, you click it, we duck it. Did your intern just open an email titled Password Audit from a not even close to your domain.ru address? No problem. We'll help you craft a vague press release that blames the cloud and provide your customers with hand-wavy assurance that you take the security and privacy of their data very seriously. Or at least you will from now on. But we have better words, the best words. We offer bronze, silver, and scapegoat tier plans. Each comes with a free trial of our Apology as a Service, now featuring AI-generated remorse. And for premium members, we'll even pay for a year of credit monitoring that nobody asked for. Additionally, all plans come with free access to our Subpoena Speed Shredder service. Byte Safe Assurance, because cybersecurity is hard, but insurance is affordable.
Byte Safe Assurance may deny claims if breach was caused by user error, crappy IT, or actual nation-state actors. Do not look directly at the heavy fumble.
All right. And again, the best part is I have absolutely no idea what that just was. So we'll all be surprised together.
Well, it's placed by our very large and expensive production company.
Absolutely.
Run by Thor and Noki.
They are experts. Yes. Media negotiation experts.
They do keep pitching a catnip producer as a sponsor. So far, I've not bid on that one.
I can understand why. All right, so getting into our stories. The first one comes from the Register, and the title here is ChatGPT Used for Evil, Fake IT Worker Resumes, Misinfo, and Cyber Op Assistance.
Say it isn't so.
I know. I can't believe that the baddies have figured out how to use OpenAI or ChatGPT for ill. There were a couple of interesting data points in here. I think there's an increasing recognition that more and more bad actors are starting to use, and I should say more and more unsophisticated bad actors are using tools like ChatGPT to build their AI. And it seems like there's a whole new arms race spinning up. And that's around the suppliers of, I'll use the scare quotes, legitimate AI tools like ChatGPT, who are continually trying to keep their tools from being used for ill. Some people will say, well, the whole idea of it is ill. But that aside, there's been an arms race around keeping it from disclosing how to build bombs and how to, and malware has been a persistent problem, and to the point where there's actually been some strictly malicious AI engines built for malicious purposes that don't have kind of the regulator on them. But in this particular article, they talk about how one actor was observed building a malicious, what seemed to me at least to be a somewhat sophisticated piece of malware that was targeted at all people gamers. It was like a scope overlay for first person shooters. So not like going after big time targets here, but nonetheless they were apparently somewhat successful. It's a little unclear how, if this was actually a widely successful campaign, but it was showing up in VirusTotal, so it had been deployed somewhat. And it was a piece of malware, again, purporting to be a first-person shooter crosshair overlay that in the end would steal credentials out of browsers and certain other things, to basically a data extractor from the victim's workstation. But what was somewhat unique about the development approach here was that the actor was incrementally building the tool kind of feature by feature using disposable accounts. So they would create an email account, they would register a ChatGPT account, free ChatGPT account, they would upload the code, they would ask it to add a certain feature, and then they would abandon that instance. They would abandon the email and the ChatGPT account, and then they would spawn another one. And in that way, they were able to apparently get through quite a lot of the gates that OpenAI has put in to prevent malicious use, which is funny because I can't even get the damn thing to create an image that I can use for our podcast, because it's saying that that violates its terms of service, and yet here are people creating malware successfully. So I'm a little annoyed, I guess.
I think what it knows is that you're too old to use it.
I think you're right. You're probably right.
It is interesting. We have talked about this for ages, that this was coming, right? This was so inevitable to anybody with a clue that this was going to be happening, that the bad actors are going to leverage these tools. But they're also doing it in ways that we didn't fully anticipate. It's interesting to watch the iterations. But the other thing that occurs to me is there's a lot of very mature, robust AI models that you can now run completely offline on commodity hardware for free, that probably would be a lot safer and a lot more robust. It's really better OPSEC than using ChatGPT with probably very similar results. So I don't know if these are just the low-level folks who are just don't know enough to download it and run it on a box with enough memory, or care, or they're just out there playing with the tools to see what they can do. I don't know. It's interesting.
It's a good question, and I'm sure there'll be people in the audience here sending us some feedback on this. But my suspicion is that the commercial ones, like the Perplexities and Claude and ChatGPT, have been trained on a lot more data than the open source models have been. That's just my supposition. I could very well be wrong, but it's a great question. I don't know the answer to that.
Yeah, I mean, the other thing I take away from this is we're going to have to account for this now and adjust kind of our expectations. Back in the olden days, we used to teach folks, look for badly worded phishing emails or non-native speaker indicators, and all that's gone. This nullifies all of that in so many ways that, I don't know, it's always an arms race. But I think we've got to continue to adjust our expectations as these new tools and new techniques using new tools start to come into the world and are utilized by the various bad actors of the world.
I think that's an important point that you hit on. I was talking mainly about malware, and the other point that this article raises is that it is being prolifically used for what I'll just broadly call social engineering. And that, I think, takes a bunch of different forms, whether it's creating the personas behind the North Korean IT worker problem, or maybe kind of outside the space of our podcast per se, but creating personas to astroturf social media with different political causes. But I think where it does hit us is it's also being used again for the perform employment fraud, but also as creating lures for phishing. And also I suspect, again, I don't know, notwithstanding that the controls or the guardrails that these models have in place, if you're a bad actor, like you can ask it, how do I get going?
Sure.
What do I, what is the most effective way to attack ABC company? And then just kind of go from there and let it kind of guide you. So, I think the challenge is, from my perspective, that it's opening the criminal economy to a population of people globally that probably otherwise wouldn't have the level of sophistication to do it. Now we've seen recent advancements in like the ransomware as a service models, and we actually have some stories about that later. I think it's really commodifying cybercrime as well,
it feels like every year we get another brick in that wall, right? As it were, it continues to lower the barrier to entry. And whether it's ransomware as a service, whether it's AI, whether it's whatever it is, it seems like that side of the house keeps making it easier for more bad actors to dip their toe in the water. Now, hopefully, at the same time, the blue teamers are getting better and the tools are getting better to defeat the low-hanging fruit, the commodity attacks that are empowered by these sorts of tools. But who knows? We just have to keep aware and keep leveling up. And hopefully our chosen vendors of choice that we run to defend our environments also keep leveling up. I personally think AI is probably going to give a bit of a leap ahead for the bad actors for a while until the defense side catches up, though. I think this is going to be better leveraged by threat actors than the defenses are ready to cope with for a little while. This will be a leap forward for them.
It certainly feels that way. I'm sure all the security vendors out there are super proud of the AI-enabled crap that they've been pushing lately. But I think that my observation is that a lot of that stuff is adopting AI for the sake of adopting AI, not necessarily using it in a way that's actually like solving the problem per se. And it'll get there, but it's again, it feels very much like the initial adoption of cloud. Like people just put their crap on cloud so they could say that they were operating in the cloud.
Indeed.
All right, so our next story comes from the Register as well, and the title here is "Your Ransomware Nightmare Just Came True, Now What?" This is an article about negotiating with your ransomware actor / adversary. And I thought it was interesting. This is not a perspective that we often get. They interview several people who are effectively ransomware negotiators. If you're a victim of a ransomware attack, you can hire different companies to come out and negotiate on your behalf. And they've given some different pointers on what to do. Like, for example, you should not, should not point out or give any indication that you've hired a negotiator, or that you have cyber insurance that might offset the cost of, any losses or payments that you make, because those will apparently send the ransomware actor, send the bill up a bit with the ransomware actor. There were some things I didn't realize, and I guess it's intuitive now that I read it. But one of the surprising points I picked out of here is that in the ransomware as a service model, I don't know if this is explicitly true or if it's just a common practice, but the affiliates typically are the attackers that break into an organization and deploy the ransomware tools. And that the tools that they're deploying are the product of the ransomware as a service provider. What I didn't realize is that after the ransomware is deployed, it's increasingly common that the affiliate kind of backs off and it becomes the job of the ransomware as a service provider to negotiate the ransom with the end victim. And the reason they do it that way, I thought was quite interesting, because the ransomware as a service operators are operating with their reputation on the line. So their concern is if they have an affiliate who is doing that negotiating, they can screw the customer, the victim, not collect the money and not deliver the decryption keys or what have you. And if that becomes common, then that ransomware as a service actor gets a bad reputation. And so they have this incentive to deal directly with the end customers and follow through on their word, I guess, as it were.
And that implies to me that the affiliate shares the decryption key with the main ransomware gang.
Yeah. And it's a little unclear to me how all that works, because I suspect that may be somewhat endemic or built into the
it could be
the deployment of the ransomware itself.
Yeah, it's interesting. Not sure. Obviously, haven't run a ransomware gang, yet. The day is young.
Yeah. Unemployment may start ticking up, and we may start looking for work. So, the other, I guess, there's something that's been nagging on me on this, and it's the idea, and they talk about several instances like Colonial Pipeline and Change Healthcare, who did pay the ransom, and they did it because they needed to get back up and running. In the case of Colonial, they're pointing out that there were, as they say, there were fuel shortages and fistfights at gas stations across the East Coast, and so that incentivized them to pay the ransom. And then similar with Change Healthcare, there were pharmacies in the U.S. that just weren't able to fill prescriptions, and so that was creating a big problem. But the thing that bothers me, as someone who has responded to and managed and whatnot hundreds of breaches and incidents, I am like the implied other side of this is that they paid the ransom, they got a key, and then they resumed operations. And it's that resumed operations that really bothers me, because, they're operating in an environment that was breached.
Yeah. How do they find and remove whatever the access methodology is and tighten up their systems so that they can't continue to be breached? Don't know.
So that concerned me. Like the whole. That's the problem I have with. I can understand the perspective of wanting to minimize harm, like especially if somebody's stolen really sensitive data and you have an opportunity to have that data not be further disclosed. I understand that. That makes sense, and it's a hedged bet. Like you pay some money, and maybe it works, maybe it doesn't. But for it to return to operations more quickly, that just seems bad to me, and maybe I'm overly naive on that.
I think it depends on the circumstances of what was encrypted, how long would it take to restore it if there's a backup, how long would it take to recreate it. Let's say it's a database of really critical information. I could restore that data of the database and probably copy that data out to another data structure, data store, and be fairly confident that it's secure, because I just need the data. I can rebuild the underlying database system and OS and such on something. And, I don't know. It's a good question. I think some of these are so complicated that it's difficult to have a blanket policy or a blanket understanding without getting into the details of each individual situation. I did see some other interesting notes. I don't know if you had other bits in the article that I made notes on. I don't know if you had some other observations and commentary there. I did see one negotiator was talking about typically the ransomware actor, when you're in negotiations, will pitch their first demand at about 5% of annual revenue of the victim company. So I was thinking maybe a really novel ransomware defense would just to have as close to zero revenue as possible.
I mean, it's a winning strategy.
I mean, look, if I'm making $100 as my revenue and they're coming to me with a 5% offer, it's $5. I mean,
$5, yeah.
I think that is some clever thought leadership that we should be exploring as a ransomware defense.
It's true.
The other thing that was interesting, quote, the longer the negotiation goes on, the more the price is likely to drop. So this is, again, a quote from one of the ransomware negotiators saying that the extortioners just want the money and, quote, it will tie up the negotiator. So they just kind of go, well, screw this. Let's just give them a nice, generous discounting edit. I don't know. That's an interesting one. That certainly, I have not been in that industry. I've not been in that role. I've not been in the job of a ransomware negotiator. But I do know that a lot of these guys also now threaten extortion by releasing data publicly. And it seems to me that if you start trying to drag on a negotiation, that's their go-to strategy to force a sense of urgency in getting you to pay up. So that one was interesting. And I don't know that, at least within the contents of this article, that the threat of public data release extortion is factored into that discussion point of dragging on the negotiations.
It seemed largely focused on the return to operation aspect, although they do have a mention of the PowerSchool breach, which, by the way, the actor there has been criminally charged. Super sophisticated 19-year-old in college. He's the one who apparently did this. And if you follow the links in the story, you can actually get to the actual criminal complaint. And apparently this started off as a ransomware attack against a telco company who, paraphrasing, but the person who was running the attack kind of tripped over their shoelaces when they were negotiating with the telco provider. They basically said, the data that we've stolen is like, there's multiple copies of it all over the place. And then later they came back and said, if you don't want us to send the data to other people, you have got to pay us the ransom. And so the telco company responded back and said, so which is it? Like, you've either sent our data all over the place, or you want us to give you money to not send it other places. And so after that, they apparently they had a signal chat where they decided they need to go after some other company, and that other company was PowerSchool. So, interesting times. They do also make a point about how increasingly there's less sophisticated actors, and they actually mention teenagers who are much less, I don't want to say they're less sophisticated in terms of like ransomware business acumen, if that's a thing, not necessarily less sophisticated in their technical abilities to conduct a ransomware attack, but they're pointing out that they tend to be more impulsive. They'll go back on their word. They'll take your money and run, and so on. So I think, one of the takeaways of this is there is some value in, number one, knowing who your ransomware actor is. And number two is having someone in your tent who understands the different ransomware actors and their motives and whatnot. And so those were some of the takeaways I got.
Yeah, that's fair. Yeah, it's interesting. The one other thing they talked about is, similarly, if you have insurance, implying cyber insurance, it's vital not to let on when negotiating with the extortionists, this quote. At a recent RSA security conference, Dutch police explained that in addition to encrypting some systems, the crooks also looked for documents related to cyber insurance. If the victim has coverage, the amount they demand goes way up, which is interesting. That's kind of tough to conceal, at least for a lot of companies I work with. They have trust portals and they have, some public-facing security documents that, usually just have an NDA or something to get through that reveal whether or not somebody has insurance as part of their SOC 2 or ISO or something like that. So that's a weird one.
Becoming increasingly common. Like if you're an IT, any type of IT services vendor,
yeah,
it's almost table stakes these days to have a cyber. Like your customers are going to demand that you have cyber insurance.
Yeah, it was an odd quote. The other one that I thought was odd was, again, quoting from the article, quote, the vast majority of ransomware operators just want low-hanging fruit. People without even basic endpoint protection who can just be spammed with malware, Carr said. Larger companies should be able to fight off all but the most determined, well-resourced attackers. I gotta agree to disagree on that one. I think we see plenty of large companies get popped by this all the time.
It's true. When I read that, the thing that was in my mind was big companies have CrowdStrike or Defender, whatever they've rebranded it, their EDR now, or SentinelOne or whatever, and small companies don't. that was how I interpreted that.
Big companies have tons of neglected infrastructure that they forget about, and complex IAM environments that they don't manage well, and end of life gear hanging out that they don't patch. Like there's all sorts of problems with big companies. So I don't know. Interesting article. Some things I don't know that I fully agree with, but I appreciate the perspective.
All right, our next story comes from Dark Reading, and the title here is How to Approach Security in an Era of AI Agents.
Drink heavily.
Yeah, or retire. That was my option.
The only winning move is not to play.
Get out of there. So this article has a very, very basic framework of controls, and it's, in my estimation, heavily skewed towards AI as an enabler for software development. And I thought it was it's interesting in the context of software development because it creates some new challenges which are described in this article. But the other thing that I was thinking of is, like, most companies, or maybe not most, but many companies right now are running off and embracing AI. And, you say what you will about it, like whether or not it's always, productive or successful is a different question. But it is like, there's report after report about how, at least in the US, the number of college grads being able to find jobs is kind of at a historic low, and that's being attributed to agentic AI and whatnot. So, but the thing that struck me was it's not just coding, it's not just software development that agentic AI is being used for. It's all sorts of things, whether it's reviewing resumes or managing HR tasks or finances or whatever. And it seems to me like the same kind of concepts that are being discussed in this article would apply in other contexts outside of software development, but the way that they're implemented might be very different, or at least in some instances. So their kind of loose framework was, number one, authentication and authorization. It's making sure that you have a tight binding of control on what the agents can do, and so that they're limited. I'm paraphrasing to a fault here, but they're limited in what they're able to access in terms of both authorization and authentication and authorization, so that they can't make changes that they shouldn't be able to, and that any changes that they are making are well enumerated, and the person they're acting on behalf of has the opportunity to kind of, quote, look over the shoulder and accept those changes. And I thought that was an interesting point, because I think where we're at right now, that thought makes sense, but I'm going to bet that in 5 years, the idea of like double checking the work of an AI agent like that is probably going to be a little bit horse and buggy. You
might be right. Or you've got a backup AI that checks the primary AI.
Yeah.
And I think it's going to be, part of this article talks about, in some of these other sections too, validating the output and validating the input and checking what the AI is doing. I think that the what's the word I wanted to use here? The attractiveness, the compelling argument, the time savings of not doing that is just going to be too compelling, and too, that siren song of just trusting the AI and just do it, move on, is just going to be too strong to maintain the level of rigor until something bad happens. And then you might do it for a while, and then you'll slip back into the just trust the AI model. It's good enough.
Yeah, and I say that not because I have this like deep trust of AI. It's just that you can kind of draw a line and see that that is going to be the next opportunity for cost savings, is figuring out how to further streamline what's already been implemented. And if you've got like lots of secondary controls around what your AI is doing, and you're not experiencing lots of losses or what have you, it's going to fall by the wayside, I would think. But
yeah,
it's still. I guess the other thing I was thinking is, it's not an unprecedented concept. Like, we have had, at least in the IT space, we've had the concept of automation systems for a long time, whether it's Kubernetes or Jenkins or Ansible or Chef or Puppet, or you can kind of go, further, or way back in the medieval times, like we would have boxes running source code repositories with automation scripts that would get automatically pushed and pulled and whatnot, provisioned to systems. That infrastructure itself becomes a weak point that has to be protected. And I think that we're focused a lot on kind of the end of the whip here, right? Like, how do we secure what the AI agent does? How do we monitor? How do we make sure that the AI agent didn't produce some kind of malicious code that then gets run in our environment? And we look at that through the lens of, well, as they say in this article, you should run any code produced by your AI agent in some sort of a sandbox to make sure that it isn't malicious before it gets run in production. But what I don't see a lot of is discussions around, well, how do you protect that AI system itself? Because that is, I think, it's going to be one of the next one-stop shops. I've seen it over and over again and we've seen this increasingly happening, where bad actors are targeting MSPs, they're targeting SolarWinds and other automation software, because it's a point of leverage. And as an attacker, you can use that thing to then compromise all of the endpoints in a company, or you can compromise the customers of the company that you're attacking, like in the case of SolarWinds. But at some point, we have to start thinking about wrapping the right kind of protection around the AI models in the infrastructure that's hosting that.
Yeah. Let's say I'm using AI for code generation, and let's say somebody could theoretically, I have no idea if this is viable, but theoretically manipulate that learning model to insert some sort of malicious code into every code snippet I generate. And is anybody validating that code? I don't know.
Yeah, so we're in the early days here, right? And I think one of the challenges that we have with this that maybe stands in contrast with other automation systems is that it's so complex that to many people it appears as a black box. But it isn't a black box. I mean, at the end of the day, it's itself an application, and therefore subject to the same sorts of tampering. Now, it might, that tampering with it might, in a useful way, might be a lot more complicated, but that doesn't mean it's impossible.
Yeah, and it's one of those things that if we get so comfortable with automated outputs and automated decision-making coming from these models, it gets very nefarious if I can somehow manipulate that model to do something that it's not supposed to or shouldn't do.
Yes.
And it's inevitable. I see it all day long now in most of the business environments I'm working in, of do more with AI to be more efficient. And I think people are going to be rewarded by their leadership for just getting stuff done. And I think we have some hard lessons to learn before we pull back from that aggressive embrace AI stance and temper it with some caution and wisdom as a in the non-security world. I think most of us in security are going, hold on a second. Nope, too late. Okay, bye.
Right. Right.
I think there's going to be some big, painful mistakes and lessons learned before before this love affair with all things AI tempers a little with reality.
100%. 100%. But look, there's going to be gnarly stuff ahead. It's inevitable, and we will learn from it. But I think in the short term, business right now is, as you said, definitely favoring people who can help navigate in the adoption of AI. And I think, as with every other technology, you can do it in a responsible manner or in irresponsible manner. And I think what I'm trying to say is, like, I'm not even sure we know what that all means. And so we got some crap to figure out.
Yeah, agreed.
All right, moving on to our next story, and this comes from Bleeping Computer, and the title here is Coinbase breach tied to bribed TaskUs support agents in India. So TaskUs is the name of a outsourcing company that provides customer support agents, and this is a follow-up to a couple stories we've covered in the past about breach of Coinbase, where Coinbase support agents were basically bribed by a threat actor to provide information about 70,000 Coinbase customers. And there's some interesting details, I thought, in this that were worth talking about. The first one was that there's some things that just don't make sense to me here. One of which is that there were two employees at TaskUs that were part of the group that was bribed, and apparently they were not the only ones. But the way this was happening, and I don't know if it was the only way, but at least the way it was happening allegedly at TaskUs, was that the agents were taking pictures on their phone of their screen. Now, if that's the case, I don't know, like, all indications are that this incident, I think it was December 26th of 2025 or 2024, like, it began and ended on the same day. And what doesn't make sense to me is that you can get 70,000 customer records using camera on your phone.
No, I didn't read that it all happened in one day. I think that's when they got caught. Like this, I got the impression this was going on for quite some time.
Well, that's what the implication is in this article.
Yeah.
But the previous reporting indicated that it was like a very, very narrow time frame.
Yeah, there's no way you would. Now, one, using your phone to capture screenshots, I somewhat understand, because a lot of these tools have some sort of DLP type solution running on them, and screenshot from somebody's phone is basic but really tough to defeat.
Mm-hmm.
So I can see that as a plausible exfiltration methodology, but you're right. You're going to iterate through 70,000 records in one day with screenshots. It also seems maybe that was just one of the methods they were using. That was a method they got caught by, or it was suspicious enough that they got caught. Maybe they exfilled in other ways and certain things had some sort of protection, some sort of DLP type prevention that they resorted to using their phone. I don't know. There's a lot of unknowns here.
Yeah. So that was one. The other is that there was a pretty significant lag between when TaskUs reported their discovery of these employees to Coinbase, and then Coinbase disclosing it to their customers. So TaskUs notified Coinbase in January of 2025. I don't see the exact date, but it was not disclosed to end customers by Coinbase until May 21st so quite some time later. and that's problematic. Like
Yeah, I'd be very curious what was going on between that, those dates. I'm sure lawyers were involved.
I would assume so. But there was another interesting aspect of this too, which was that after this incident was discovered, I don't know exactly what all happened, but apparently the operations between, or the support of TaskUs to Coinbase was severed, and they had 226 people working on Coinbase's account, and they suspended them all, or I guess they actually terminated all of them. And then after the investigation, they identified that there was only 2 people involved, and those people were just summarily terminated. The others were given a severance package, which I think they characterized as a healthy or generous package. And I didn't realize it. Apparently, this was fairly big news in India, and there were actually protests of the termination of these 226 people in the local community there. Now, the other thing I'll say is I have, in my past, operated call centers out of India and other locations too, supporting sensitive operations, financially sensitive operations, not like classified stuff. And in those instances, I didn't think I was particularly sophisticated. Like we would require people to be searched on their way in and out. Like you were not allowed to take your phone or camera. We didn't even let people take pens and paper in and
You
out.
monster.
I know we were jerks. I agree. But for this very reason, because we were at the time, this was back when it was in vogue to steal credit card numbers, which is far less common at the moment. But I didn't think that was very novel. And it's interesting to see that some organization like Coinbase, which, by the way, aspires to be the de facto financial services application on everybody's phone across the whole world, is again, not doing things in a sensible way from a security perspective. So interesting follow-up, I thought.
Yeah, I think so. We're getting a little bit more information every time, as time goes on, as to who and what happened. I hopefully will get more information as to how they exfiled nearly 70,000 customer records. I agree, it probably wasn't via screenshots.
Yeah, and it does sound like, and I can't find the quote right now, but it does sound like TaskUs was just one provider that was among potentially many, or some number that were part of this.
So quoting TaskUs spokesperson confirmed they were involved, but stated the employees were recruited as part of a much larger coordinated criminal campaign. Whatever that means. Exactly. So, we stated this in the previous episode. We talked about this. This is a real problem that is not going to be easy to solve. And I don't think a lot of non-traditional financials are looking at this problem right now. And I think it's likely to bite more folks. I mean, how plausible is it to pay somebody to deploy ransomware? Pretty plausible, depending on what permissions they have on their machine. Somebody overseas in a low cost of living, low income environment, I offer them $100. That's a lot of money to some people.
Absolutely. We one of my previous assignments, we were expanding into Africa, our employee base in Africa, because like it or not, India is getting expensive. And so labor arbitrage always likes to find lower cost countries to move to. And Africa is one of the last bastions of that. And I don't mean like South Africa. I mean like Nigeria and some of those places. And even Nigeria is not it's not as economically depressed as it once was. But at the time, at least, the laptops we were issuing were like the value of 2 or 3 years of salary.
Jeez.
And so you can understand how with relatively little investment, it would be possible, in certain circumstances to bribe people to take otherwise, malicious actions. So, and I
And
don't
I
know.
doubt that's on anybody's radar when they're making those decisions about staffing and staffing costs and staffing locations.
No, because I mean, look, if it goes wrong, it's you as the manager of those people, that's a failing of yours. You should have done a better job at managing your employees.
Well, you know where I think the next untapped low cost labor market's going to be?
Where's that?
Children. They're everywhere. They got plenty of free time.
Mm-hmm. Lots of energy.
Lots of energy. Look, I mean, I saw this quote the other day. I thought it made a lot of sense. In the early 1800s, we took children out of the mines. What's one of the most popular games with children today? Minecraft. They yearn for the mines, Jerry. We've denied them.
I think I saw that too. Yeah.
We've denied them what they inherently want. So I think we have to start making games called call center for kids and just train them to be call center employees.
There's something to that. I was,
we could pay them in popsicles.
I was browsing through the PlayStation store a couple days ago, and there's lawn cutting lawn service simulator, where you literally drive around on a lawn tractor, and that's the game.
Yay!
I don't know what to say about that. So anyway, moving on. The next and last story also comes from the Register, and the title here is "Deliberate Attack Deletes Shopping Apps, AWS, and GitHub Resources."
Ouchie.
There is a company in India called Kirana Pro. I think I'm pronouncing that right. It is basically I can't think of a good equivalent we have in the US. Maybe Instacart, I guess, would be something similar. But basically, it's an app that you run on your phone. You can order groceries, and this app bids it out to stores in your area, and they kind of bid on providing supplying the food for that, and then they win the bid. They set up delivery to the customer. Anyhow, I guess it's a fairly popular service in India. They handle 2,000 orders each day, which is nothing to sneeze at. Yeah, their entire AWS account and GitHub environment repo was cleaned out.
That seems like a problem.
Now, at the time this article was written, this looked like it was some sort of a hack, having come from the cloud background. I started thinking about either they had a system in their environment that was, vulnerable to something, and it had overprivileged credentials that let the attacker get into the control plane, or, they had leaked some keys. But it was a little weird because it impacted both their GitHub and their in their AWS account. So my inclination would be that it's probably a GitHub key that then leaked that included AWS keys in the repo. So once they got the GitHub key, they were able to kind of go after it. But the point was, the CEO was hell bent that this is a very targeted attack. Was intended to put them out of business. And at least it's the time of this writing, they were still down and trying to recover. But in a follow-up post by the CEO on X, he points out that this was not an attack, and he makes some questionable assertions, but this, that their environment was not attacked and whatnot. But it was in fact the product of an insider. So apparently one of their employees or contractors is the person who actually wiped their AWS and GitHub accounts. And that's a problem. And as I was thinking about this is like, as somebody who's supported financial services, companies and whatnot in the past, like we would do a lot of stuff to put in activity monitoring and limit the ability of people to do certain things. And we even did that in the context of our cloud control plane in my last assignment. But like it's a really heavyweight thing. It's not trivial. In any stretch of the imagination, it is not trivial to do, and it is the antithesis of speedy development. I will tell you that in fast operations. I was kind of contemplating like the challenge you have as a startup. Like you have implicit trust in your IT team. And that got me to thinking, like, I'm surprised this doesn't happen more often.
Yeah. And what we understand as well is that this was an ex-employee as a revenge, at least according to the CEO. In his ex-posts, he's saying this was an ex-employee, so some sort of revenge tactic. So yeah, at the very basic item there, I'm contemplating, hey, when you're terminating or somebody's voluntarily leaving an organization who has such trust level of access, do a good job of shutting down their accounts. Making sure they're truly out. But yeah, you have to trust. You have to trust somebody. I mean, yeah, you could back up all stuff, but somebody somewhere has the keys to know how to defeat that or set it up. Or as you said, it's very costly, it's very slow, it's very expensive to have true multiple backups that are non-repeatable, that are not able to be impacted by a single person. But that is very complicated and very slow to today's very fast-paced environment and expensive. So startups, yeah, it's a tough one.
I missed that it was a former employee.
That's what I'm seeing on X.
Instead, this was an internal data breach. Specifically, it was the result of actions taken by a trusted internal employee who had legitimate access to our system.
Yep. So if you follow the CEO's account.
Well, I only read this post. Okay.
Yeah.
Got it.
So there's a post that came out on June 5th on X that the CEO retweeted from somebody else saying it is a good summary of the hack incident. And so just reading through this particular post thread, kind of interesting. So it started with one ex-employee. It ended with nothing left on AWS. So on May 26th, executives logged into AWS. What they found: no EC2 instances, no logs, no root access. The app was live, but the backend was destroyed. Even their 2FA in AWS was compromised. The Google Authenticator had already been changed. The entry point, a former employee's account. The hackers, or ex-employee, used it to breach AWS's root account, breach GitHub, wipe out the EC2 infrastructure, exfiltrate names, addresses, payment info, delete source code. Total system wipe and no logs to trace it.
That's a good find.
Yeah, so I'll send you this. You can put it in the show notes. But the company had MFA. They had Google Authenticator, but they didn't rotate access after staff exits. They didn't set proper access limits. They didn't separate root keys from daily operations. So
that'll do it.
Let's see.
That'll do it.
Lessons learned: delete old user credentials immediately. Again, I'm reading from this. Never let devs keep root access. Don't tie core infrastructure into a single MFA device. Monitor Git and IAM logs daily. Backups aren't optional ever. I would agree with all that. The guy says, this wasn't a hack, it was negligence. That's a strong phrase. Again, in a startup environment, it's tough to get all these things right. So, sorry, I stepped on what you were going to say.
No, so just to reiterate, like that's a good find. I'm glad you followed that path farther than I did. So a couple of things that struck me when I read the CEO's X post was they don't seem incredibly sophisticated. And maybe that's an unfair characterization, but
who doesn't? The company or the
company? The company.
Okay.
And so this was the product of their investigation. I don't know if they hired, a company to come and investigate, but the thing that I guess was nagging on me a little bit was many, I won't say all or even most, but many breaches occur using legitimate credentials. And then you are faced with the prospect of determining whether or not the credentials were used by the person they were assigned to or by someone who managed to steal them or come into possession of them. So I'm going to give them grace and say they figured out that it was in fact this person that is ex-employee. But like you said,
they name and shame, by the way, in the X thread by the CEO. They name specifically who they think did it. So let's get out. I'm sorry, I interrupted you again.
Fascinating. No, that's a little surprising.
The other thing that's interesting is I have no idea how valid this is, but apparently there was a lot of people slinging back at the CEO that he wasn't treating his staff well. I have no idea any validity to that allegation. There's always people who hate the leaders of a company for simply being the leaders of the company, but there's a lot of vibe of, well, you treated your people poorly and this is what happens. I have no idea. Probably some validity to that concept. I have no idea if that's the case in this scenario.
Yeah. I agreed. Still is a crime in almost in any place, I guess, whether or not it was warranted, maybe a different question that I am not at all qualified to answer.
Same.
But this is our job, is to defend IT infrastructure for organizations. I thought the CEO laid out a pretty good recounting of what, of their lessons learned, but maybe I take it for granted. Like, it just seems like offboarding is such a basic concept, and in this instance, I guess it was not done. And by the way, I think, especially in Cloudland, this is made much more difficult because you have the concept of API keys, and we've been railing against for years now. Like, you've got to make sure that you build your applications in a way that you can actually rotate your keys. I don't have any idea or any insight if that contributed in this instance, but I know that, like, I have struggled with this in the past when people exit the business and they had access to keys. We have to go change those keys, and I cannot tell you how many times I've been told, like, how difficult and painful it's going to be because we didn't build the application to do that.
Yep. Same constant problem.
Yeah.
I mean, in theory, you should build from the beginning with that in mind, but it's rarely the case. And then it's very difficult to retrofit, and it becomes a tech debt issue.
All right. That is the show for this week. I hope you all liked it, or at least found it useful. If you didn't find it useful, maybe you can send it to your enemies. I don't know. But either way, like, you like it or you don't like it, you can. It's free to leave us a 5-star review on your favorite podcast platform.
Nothing would harm us more if you hated the show than giving us a 5-star review, and nothing would help us more if you love the show than giving us a 5-star review. It's like a weird quantum mechanics thing. I can't fully explain it, but all I know is that that's what you do.
It's the area between the light and the dark.
But anyway, hey, thanks for listening. Hopefully you enjoyed the show.
Absolutely. I will include links to the stories we talked about on our website at defensivesecurity.org. Just look for episode 309 and you will find links to everything we talked about. And I'll also include a link to our Patreon page in case you are interested in supporting our mission. And again, thank you to those who do. In the meantime, where can people find you if they would like to get in touch?
I am on your very fine Mastodon server at infosec.exchange. at Lerg, L-E-R-G, and also on X at Lerg, L-E-R-G, and kick it around the crazy wild environs of LinkedIn just because I like the drama.
It is chock full of drama for sure.
It sure is.
You can find me on infosec.exchanges at Jerry at infosec.exchange. And I also am on LinkedIn, although I spend a lot less time there. But my name on LinkedIn is Malicious Link. So if you want to find me there.
And you are indeed a malicious link.
That's true. Funny story. Like told people to find me on LinkedIn, and they're like, well, all I could find was a malicious link. Obviously not me. Anyway, that is me. Talk again next week. Thank you, everybody.
Have a great week. Goodbye.